join the chorus in thanking the organizers for organizing this wonderful event, and thanking Sven for kindly including me in this. I'm delighted to be here again. And of course, I'm delighted to see several old friends and to meet more now. Some of my remarks today are quite pointed, and some of my observations will be rather blunt. So I wish to reaffirm in advance my abiding commitment in principle and in practice to optimism, though when examining social history and practices, to unflinching realism. Most of my examples are from the USA, so that no one may fault me for besmirching another's country, but similar examples abound elsewhere and will be both pervasive and obvious. Pick your favorites, nationally or internationally. I shall consider European juridical history sufficiently to show that my US examples typify a broad sweep of Enlightenment struggles, including Kant's and Hegel's struggles for justice against mere legality. Right? The principle of rule of law does not require the rule of just law. And this has finally been recognized by many leading legal theorists. This contrast between legality and justice is, of course, Kant's point of departure in the Rechtslehre. It's also Hegel's point of departure in his outlines of justice. I'm sorry, the English translations of the title are all miserable, so I'm going to call Rechtsphilosophie his philosophical outlines of justice. And as for the starting point, yes, the remark to section 3, he wastes no time getting to work on this. And let's see, how's my best? Yes. So I'm going to direct attention right off the bat to issues about criteria and justification, not to cast doubt upon them, but to cast a lot of doubt on the typical approaches to them. The problems now tearing apart the USA were already manifest during my childhood. Their basis and implications have not changed, merely their virulence and brazen irresponsibility are shamelessly displayed in public and even proclaimed in the name of patriotism. In brief, the USA never has been the Rechtsstaat that might have perhaps been envisioned by its Declaration of Independence. Although the Unionists won the Civil War, they have lost the continuing battle for the supremacy of just national law, before which all are equal, not only in principle, but also in practice, and indeed as a matter of due course. Legislation in the USA remains a contest between individuals and groups competing for maximal benefits for themselves. Justice, the public good, and cogent reasoning are the casualties. Consensus means, in that context, nothing outside one's own faction or coalition. And such debates and contests exhibit an ancient problem classically formulated by Sextus Empiricus, which you have, of course, on the slide in the handout, the dilemma of the criterion. In order to decide the dispute which has arisen about the criterion of truth, we must possess an accepted criterion by which we shall be able to judge the dispute. And in order to possess an accepted criterion, the dispute about the criterion must first be decided. And when the argument thus reduces itself to a form of circular reasoning, the discovery of the criterion becomes impracticable, since we do not allow those who make knowledge claims to adopt a criterion by assumption. Well, if they offer to judge a criterion by a criterion, we force them into regress ad infinitum. And furthermore, since the demonstration requires a demonstrated criterion, while the criterion requires an approved demonstration, they are forced into circular reasoning. Now, this dilemma is fully general. It concerns rational justification in any and all domains, whether cognitive or moral, whether theoretical or practical. It's widely regarded as insoluble. if solving it requires no less and no more than strict deductive proof, it is insoluble. But that's a mere appearance. If justifying deduction, or likewise justifying induction, require nothing but strictly deductive proof, they too are unjustifiable. Deduction requires monotonic inferential links between premises. As such, deduction cannot assess the accuracy, truth, cogency, or even relevance of any premise, nor any term or symbol used in a formally stated argument. Any formal statement of a deductive proof contains no cognitive justification. Whatever cognitive justification is provided by deductive or also by inductive proof is within the understanding of whomever comprehends the proof by comprehending the accuracy and cogency of the premises, the validity of their inferential links, and the sufficiency of supporting evidence, if any, is required. Comprehension involves much more than merely reiterating or rehearsing the proof. It requires self-assessment of one's understanding and use of the premises and inferential links, and if any, is relevant evidence to distinguish so well as one can between merely apparent cogency and sound proof. In fleeing psychologism, too many philosophers abandon judgment to focus solely upon propositions, but propositions themselves do no work whatsoever. We must work with them and assess how well we work with them in order to assess, to reason, or to know anything by using propositions properly. These elementary points about deductive proof and the ineliminability of critical self-assessment do not solve the dilemma of the criterion, yet they do point in the right direction. Critical self-assessment can enable us to assess the merits of any principles, premises, terms, inferences, or evidence used in justificatory reasoning, our own as well as others. Critical self-assessment requires, however, that our principles, premises, evidence, and that our current or proposed use of them are not exhausted by our current thoughts or statements about them. It requires our capacity to assess and, if need be, to revise and improve our comprehension, formulation, or use of our principles, premises, and evidence as we grapple with the issues or circumstances we seek to understand and to assess. Resolving that dilemma requires rescinding Cartesian self-transparency and the apparent transparency of one's own present thoughts. This may sound stipulative, but not so. One can construct whatever conceptual structure one likes, but thinking about any genuine issue concerns that issue in its actual context and actual implications. Hence, what we think, how we think, and what we ought best to think must answer to the issue, its actual context, and its actual implications. What we may happen presently to think about them is no ultimate standard. All this is involved in conceptual explication, in contrast to mere conceptual analysis. Conceptual explication is fundamental to Kant, to Hegel, and to Carnot, all of whom recognize that properly explicating any key concept, principle, or term seeks to improve clarity, accuracy, and our usage in its or in their proper contexts. Conceptual explications must and can only be assessed within humanly possible contexts of their actual use, not in merely imaginary contexts of their logically possible use. Right? Much of contemporary Anglophone analytic philosophy has no idea that it's deeply indebted, not just to Descartes, but to Etienne Tempier's 1277 Wesensverdammung in Paris. Unbelievable. But on the basis of these points about conceptual explication and about self-assessment and the assessment of our use of our principles and so on, Hegel worked out a very subtle, cogent solution to the dilemma of the criterion in the Einleitung to the Phänomenologie des Geistes, and used it throughout the book to assess the insights and oversights in each apparent form of knowing, within his comprehensive and systematic taxonomy and assessment of them, winnowing and integrating the successes of each whilst remedying their deficiencies. Due to highly fractious contemporaneous philosophical discussion, not an ancient fact, Hegel kept quiet about his sources and many of his findings to forestall mere cavil and to foster critical assessment and self-assessment. One key, if implicit, connection is this. Hegel's Phänomenologisches Geistes develops in comprehensive detail the topic merely mentioned in Kant's final chapter, the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the history of pure reason, which to, as it were, diehard wannabe a priorist looks like an oxymoron. So I turn to Kant's critical lead. It'll be most helpful now to note core features of Kant's account of rational judgment and justification, which implicitly but quite directly feed into Hegel's solution of the dilemma of the criterion. Central to Kant's critique of our human powers of rational judgment and justification are 5 basic points, at least, but let's stick with 5. First, and they're on the screen, reasoning using rules or principles always requires judgment to guide the proper use and application of the rule or principle to the case or cases at hand. Specifying rules of application cannot eliminate this issue because those rules of application also require judgment for their proper use. Second, rational judgment is inherently normative insofar as it contrasts to mere response to circumstances by forming or revising beliefs, because judgment involves considering whether, how, or to what extent the considerations one now draws together in forming and considering a specific judgment or conclusion or inference are integrated as they ought best be integrated to form an accurate, justifiable judgment. And third, rational judgment is in these same regards inherently self-critical. Judging some circumstances or considerations involves or requires assessing whether or the extent to which one assesses those circumstances or considerations as they ought best be assessed. And, big topic here, rational judgment is inherently social and communicable insofar as judging some circumstances or considerations rationally involves acknowledging the distinction in principle between merely convincing oneself that one is judged properly and actually judging properly by properly assessing the issues and relevant considerations at hand. Fourth, rational judgment is inherently sorry, I did that. I got ahead of my slide. Fifth, recognizing one's own fallibility, one's own potentially incomplete information or analysis, and one's own theoretical or practical predilections requires that we each check our judgments. First, by determining as well as we can whether the grounds and considerations integrated in any judgment we pass are such that they can be communicated to all others who can assess our grounds in judgment, so also to find them adequate. But the modality there is crucial. Second, check, by actually communicating our judgments and considerations to others to seek and consider their assessment of our judgments and considerations. Right? That's part of why we keep meeting like this. An important part of why we keep meeting like this. Kant's stress upon self-assessment and communicability of our judgments, in a phrase, his publicity requirement, serve to distinguish as well as humanly possible, individually and collectively, what merely appears to anyone or to any group to be accurate and well justified, and what is accurate and well justified to the best of our knowledge of any and all public topics, features of our natural world, of our social circumstances, and of our beliefs, attitudes, and actions regarding any and all of these. Kant's findings about rational judgment, justification, and publicity directly inform the universalizability tests of the categorical imperative and likewise the universal principle of justice. To corroborate and augment these findings by Kant, Hegel argues cogently that our mutual recognition of one another as rationally competent, sufficiently informed, yet finite and fallible cognizant agents is constitutive of our own being rationally competent, sufficiently informed, yet finite and fallible cognizant agents. Back to issues about criterion justification in section 3. Securing peace requires securing justice, so that each and all are secure in their just acquisitions and actions, which requires our and anyone's security against others' infringement or invasion of our legitimate rights in their exercise, whether unwitting or malicious. How, if at all, can we identify and distinguish whatever is just from mere appearances of or pretenses to justice? Here, the dilemma of the criterion looms large, as it should. It cannot be addressed cogently by any of the common approaches pursued by moral philosophers or jurists, which inevitably take as basic premises whatever people may think, believe, feel, claim, or legislate by law to be just. The most such approaches can do is identify and seek to systematize the commitments of whatever groups sufficiently share those purported basic premises. Justice, however, cannot be justice merely for agreeable people. It must address those issues and problems posed by the morally ignorant, negligent, or outright vicious. And just who are these and why so? These questions, too, raise the dilemma of the criterion. Appealing to a transcendent being won't help, independently of issues about truth or falsehood. Appealing to a transcendent being won't help because such appeals are so often fractious, disingenuous, or even murderous. I'm sorry. Tayyip Erdogan is nur scheinheilig. Appealing to positive law won't help because merely being written into a constitution or a legal code does not suffice to identify or distinguish between justice and injustice, in contrast to legality and illegality within some jurisdiction. Appealing to what Kant calls the dignity or incommensurable value of humanity within each and every person won't help, because whether there are incommensurable values remains hotly contested by utilitarians and disregarded by so-called virtue theorists. And appealing to empirical facts is certainly necessary, but it won't suffice, because facts as such do not suffice to identify or resolve issues of legitimacy, including permissibility. And indeed, none of the typical moral theories or methods prominent today, nor in the previous 2 centuries, can address these fundamental issues about identifying and justifying genuine principles of justice. I know that's a very strong claim. My homework is in print. Fortunately, there is a cogent method for identifying and justifying the core of a universally valid natural law morality without appeal to moral realism, nor to purportedly moral motivations, to game theory, utility, however calculated or distributed, manifest preferences, validity claims, nor to Kant's account of dignity, nor indeed to metaphysics at all. The method, of course, was discovered by Kant and adopted and augmented by Hegel, yet the core principle is quite common, historically and globally. One formulation is found in the Hippocratic Oath, which is here at the bottom of the screen right now. Above all, I shall do no harm, nor shall I commit injustice. An excellent oath for medicine, but not only for medicine. Versions of this principle can be found globally across cultures, religions, and history. To use this principle requires identifying, accurately of course, what counts as just and unjust, and what counts as unwarranted harm. Right? Surgery involves cutting somebody open. But, as we all know, if it's done properly, it's a gain in health. Kant's universalizability test, using the categorical imperative or the universal principle of justice, stressed the publicity of just or morally permissible maxims or actions by proscribing as wrong any action or any maxim that is the principle of action, which requires for its success that the rational agency of any other person be either evaded or overpowered. Any action or maxim which can only succeed by evading or overpowering anyone else's freedom of thought or action cannot be rationally justified because it fails Kant's explication of rational judgment and justification as signaled by its publicity requirement, as I summarized anyway in section 2.3. Using this criterion of right action requires that we know and understand human agency and our human circumstances of action here on earth, within our present circumstances. Using Kant's moral principles requires, as he insists, a practical anthropology, which catalogs our human capacities and incapacities for reasoning, acting, and suffering. To this, Hegel adds, the proper use of Kant's juridical principles requires a comprehensive political economy and theory of social institutions to understand our principles and actions within our actual social circumstances so that we can and do attend to the unintended consequences of our actions and collective interactions. Minor things like global warming. Hegel expressly upholds Kant's fundamental principles in their use. Hegel addresses core issues of their actual use within our actual societies. Whoops. Where's it at? I turn to moral autonomy and education, and what Barbara Herman aptly calls training to autonomy. Literally, autonomy means being law unto oneself, or self-legislating. Confusions about Kant's account of moral autonomy persist by simply assuming that individual autonomy consists in creating one's own moral code. And that, of course, is the exact opposite of Kant's account, because that approach virtually ensures total mutual misunderstanding and interference. Kant is quite right that also in the life of the mind, there is a direct counterpart to Hobbes' state of nature, and he names Hobbes in that connection, in close connection with some of the passages I cited about judgment. Legislating requires not only a rule of action or omission, but also enacting it as obligated. It's the gable, the legislating of moral requirement to oneself. What we ourselves authorizing Kant's account of moral autonomy is holding ourselves accountable to moral requirement. Moral imperatives are categorical insofar as they are obligatory, regardless of one's contingent wants, hopes, or aims. This has its exact parallel regarding cognitive autonomy, that we hold ourselves accountable to the requirements of accurate, justifiable cognitive judgment. Such autonomy of individual rational judgment is required to understand and assess evidence, testimony, theory, explanations, expert opinion, policy proposals, or any advice, in contrast to merely accepting or rejecting them. And that holds both in morals and in cognition. This is Kant's autonomy of rational judgment and justification. Now, nothing is automatic about individual rational autonomy. Kant agrees entirely with both Aristotle and Hegel about our manifold mutual interdependencies, including such details as birth, nurture, upbringing, education, both informal and formal, and commerce. Hence, Kant agrees entirely with both Aristotle and Hegel about our being and so on politikon, and about the decisive importance of fidelity to reason. All three highlight that anyone's recognizing and affirming one's decisive obligation to hold oneself responsible to moral and to cognitive requirement requires sufficient, adequate education. Given a good enough start, each of us can, with diligence, continuing developing our rational autonomy and acquiring relevant, accurate information to inform our properly judging whatever matters come before us. So doing requires that we learn to suspend our own presumptions, prejudices, beliefs, or preferences regarding that topic so that these too can be reassessed and either rejected, revised, or corroborated. Ongoing critical assessment can provide further evidence in favor of the initial view, right? Corroboration is part of that list. The universality fundamental to Kant's universalization tests is the universality required for publicity to scrutinize one's own best judgments and to afford their public scrutiny so that we can identify objectively actual states of affairs, or also just and feasible policies, and distinguish these from error, insufficient accuracy, or insufficient justification, whether innocent or deliberate. So I turn now to issues about enlightenment, both individual and collective, which Kant directly addresses. Enlightening individuals through proper education and training to autonomy is feasible, as Kant notes at the end of the Orientation and Thinking. You have the main passage there on the screen. Right, to employ one's own reasons means simply to ask oneself, whenever one is urged to accept something, right, this is a counter to acceptance. It's not a demand to make everything up yourself. Whenever one is urged to accept something, whether one finds it possible to transform the reason for accepting it or the rule which follows from what is accepted into a universal principle governing the use of one's reason. Everyone can apply this test to oneself, and then superstition and zealotry will be seen to vanish, I'll say directly, even if the individual lacks sufficient knowledge to refute them on objective grounds. Hence, it is easy to lay the basis of enlightenment in individual subjects by education. One must merely begin early to accustom young minds to this reflection. But as you know, in this same passage, Kant also notes a key problem confronting public reason and reasoning publicly. Because in contrast, and this is at the bottom of the screen, to enlighten an age is arduous. For there are numerous external obstacles which either proscribe that manner of education or burden its implementation. Accordingly, Kant notes that his own age of enlightenment is not itself an enlightened age. The problems confronting enlightenment that Kant notes in answering the Academy Prize question, what is enlightenment, remain problems today, and indeed more pervasively and urgently so. Nevertheless, training to autonomy and the enlightenment this fosters is not optional. In the Doctrine of Virtue, Kant addresses the difficult challenge to properly explicate a crucial class of strict self-regarding duties. Central among these is the strict duty to hold oneself responsible for moral requirement, and this is the duty to become and to maintain one's moral autonomy and to assess one's own moral conscientiousness. So doing is no luxury. Kant argues, soundly I submit, I won't go through it now, that acquiring any individual, or as the lawyers say, subjective right, requires understanding that right, its scope and its limits, and its constitutive juridical duty to exercise one's right only rightfully, by identifying and omitting any abusive misuses of that right to which one is not at all entitled, neither by one's right nor by general juridical principles. Both Rechtsfähigkeit and moral imputability require individual autonomy. Nothing less and nothing else can do. From these considerations, we can also grasp the fundamental moral, juridical, and civil principle of humility, which of course loses out in the polemical debates that are so popular in public, of refraining from believing or acting so as to impose one's own views or actions upon others merely because one supposes one may so believe or act. And with that, we return to the injunction classically formulated in the Hippocratic Oath, and more precisely in Kant's universalizability tests. So I come now to the hardest part, about the precarities of public reasoning, and returning to issues of theory and practice, because the theoretical challenges that I've reviewed, right, the dilemma, the criterion, the character and requirements of rational judgment and justification, and the individual autonomy involved in holding oneself responsible to moral and to cognitive requirement, are not merely theoretical issues. They are profoundly practical. So let me spell out some reasons why, briefly. Born near Chicago in 1955, I grew up in the Cold War, in the fallout of the notorious McCarthy era, in the stifling conservative conformism of white middle-class respectability. Yet for a goy, I learned about the atrocities of the two world wars, including the Holocaust, quite early. Neighboring Chicago was a civics lesson in realpolitik of the sort shunned by U.S. civics classes. I was confronted with virulent, ignorant white racism when the Evanston schools introduced a busing program to bring black students to much better, predominantly white schools. That was '66. Indeed, '66 was a very important year. I had the enormous fortune, young as I was, 11, to hear Martin Luther King Jr. preach at the First Methodist Church of Evanston, following his march through segregated neighborhoods on the near west side of Chicago. My memories of that occasion remain fresh to this day. Already very alert to events and to issues of justice, I grew up through the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the student protests against the Vietnam War, third-wave feminism, and the rise of environmentalism. I was a very interested observer, too young to participate, but only so, omitting doing anything stupid, harmful, or counterproductive. In each of these hotly contested issues, I witnessed the same fundamental problem, each side of each issue insisting ever more loudly that it alone was right and righteous, and that the opposing faction was wrong and either deluded or wicked or both, usually under the heading of communism, used entirely indiscriminately to condemn anything that corporate America didn't like. Accordingly, I devoted my studies and career to determining whether the dilemma criterion can be solved and whether cogent criteria of objectivity can be identified and justified in moral philosophy and in epistemology, including HPS, and especially so after reading Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I'm sorry, stimulating but disastrous book. Finding positive, insightful resolutions for these issues, as I have by rejecting philosophical factions and fads, and by painstaking scrutiny of especially Kant's and Hegel's texts and views, etches yet more deeply the problems of implementing sound theory within our extraordinarily messy, fractious practices, both within philosophy and within our social lives, domestically and internationally. Now, the liberality of liberal education was already identified by Aristotle. It's the public education required to be and to conduct oneself as a free citizen within one's polity. This education was fostered and beautifully illustrated by Gerard von Landsberg and Hortus Deliciarum, circa 1180. These methods were examined and illustrated by Kant both as matters of general pedagogy and specifically pertaining to moral education. These pedagogical methods were used by Hegel, especially as rector and professor of preparatory philosophical studies at the Nuremberg Gymnasium, and are central to his civic republicanism. The deleterious encroachment of professional schools upon the proper tasks of liberal university education were detailed and urgently decried by John Stuart Mill in the directorial address to the University of Edinburgh, that's 1867, the fountainhead of a swelling current of detailed diagnostics and recommendations into the present day. The problems remain the same. Though not unique in this regard, Occidental cultures and nations have stressed individual rights of various sorts without proper attention to the responsibilities constitutive of any such individual right, nor to the kind of education required for any putative rights holder to understand these crucial issues and to act accordingly, that is, responsibly. By happenstance, I was lucky. I received much of the course education from my dear mother Alice, who early taught me not to settle for easy answers. And from my high school training in library research and thesis papers with which I could make the most of my university and graduate studies. And I've done all I can to provide these same skills to my own students, often with a lot of success. In the USA, the public education required for enlightened and responsible citizenship were well understood by Thomas Jefferson, who proposed its legislation in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1778. No such education has been mandated in the USA, though individual schools or school districts may undertake its provision. The reasons constantly urged in the USA against liberal education for proper citizenship are always the same. Penny wisdom complaining of costs, coupled with pound foolishness disregarding the devastating and far greater expenses of inadequate education. Read the news coming out of the States. Due to its original federation of states, the USA has no Ministry of Education setting national standards or curriculum. Standards and curricula are entirely the responsibility of individual states and local school districts. Yes, there's a U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, but it only handles some funding issues in regard to education. The situation has been worsened by publishers aiming to produce textbooks for nationwide use. Expanding markets in this way has required content limited to national consensus. In such a fractious nation, this consensus is very meager. Textbooks are rewritten by committee to try to ensure offending no one. Thus, historical and current offenses are avoided or at least are expurgated, and the resulting expository style is simply atrocious. And it's not a surprise that student achievement continues to decline on the whole in the USA, especially though not only in history. Angered by liberal reforms to improve justice, the Republican Party has shamelessly promoted appointing justices to the Supreme Court solely on the basis of conservative orientation. The historical school covered by Hegel, which I'll turn to in a moment, is reincarnated by the vacuous but enormously popular juridical slogan in the states of original intent, which is used to block any laws which they cannot write in the black letters of the U.S. Constitution. As if there were no original intent of the U.S. Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the U.S. Constitution to form a more perfect union, as Lincoln later put it. As Hegel's philosophy is so deeply Kantian in principle, allowing Hegel to attend extensively and intensively to institutional, legal, and juridical history, I'll draw briefly from Hegel to more sharply focus the precarities of public reason and public reasoning. Hegel recognized in print the abomination of slavery, also within the USA. Leopold von Henning testified that Hegel's philosophy of history always celebrated the ideals of the French Revolution, even in its final presentation. Whilst Edward Gans, internationally renowned jurist and expert on Hegel's philosophies of justice and of world history, expressly noted that Hegel's philosophical outlines of justice expanded upon, further undergirded, and augmented Rousseau's and Kant's Republican principles of justice and liberty. And indeed, Hegel's Outlines of Justice details the most robust account of civic republicanism we have. No wonder he was the butt of such ideological excoriation for a century and a half. There, Hegel argues cogently, incisively, and persistently for inclusive republican justice against the conservative historical school of jurisprudence headed by Haller, Hugo, and von Savigny. The historical school of jurisprudence is positivist. Law is whatever it is said to be within some specified jurisdiction. The historical school merely preferred old positive law, especially Roman law, and countered, among much else, attempts to revise Germanic law to provide uniformity across the German regions. And some of you will know about Das Allgemeine Landrecht. That's 1791. Hegel argued expressly against the historical school and argued repeatedly against the views of Haller and Hugo by name in print, and in many footnotes, Hegel singles out absurdities and irrationalities in Roman law, demonstrating why Roman law, so cherished by the historical school, can indeed be a key source, yet no ultimate foundation for jurisprudence. The conservative hegemony of purely positive law persisted in Prussia under Friedrich Wilhelm IV and Bismarck, who skillfully outmaneuvered liberal reform, and indeed this hegemony of sheer positive law persisted after Bismarck right up to World War II, and has always been ruthlessly deployed by autocrats. Yet autocrats have no monopoly on legal positivism, nor its use to evade or suppress justice. Freedom, justice, republicanism, and popular representation all require and deserve educated, competent, engaged, responsible citizens. However, from the outset, the USA persistently blocked and continues to block proper public education. As commercial and technological developments have made our societies ever more complex and interlinked, our publics have become ever more, relatively speaking, that is, in comparison to what we need to know these days, ever more poorly educated and informed, and hence ever less prepared to understand these developments and deal with them responsibly. Yes, juridical progress has been made in the USA, for example, by the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which outlawed segregated schooling across the USA, and by the Voting Rights Act, 1965. However, each of these advances has suffered subsequent degradation in practice as conservatives have restricted their implementation or buttressed segregation as practices by other means, including statute law. And that is why the main trend is correctly indicated in the brief remarks, despite some, obviously landmark, apparent counter-evidence. Public reason and reasoning cogently in public are decisive. Little wonder they remain thwarted in practice. That is the predicament confronting us everywhere. In his prescient novel, 1984, Orwell envisioned telescreens, devices which inundate people with relentless government propaganda, whilst recording their every word and deed. Well, nothing so crude these days. Instead of telescreens, we have so-called smartphones to do these jobs for any industry or government who seeks to have them done. Having now unwittingly created the Anthropocene, we have much negligence and denial to answer for, and much urgent work to accomplish if indeed we are to secure justice, peace, liberty, or indeed life for all. The principles of rational judgment and public reason are clear and cogent, whilst public reasoning has become ever more precarious. That is our urgent dilemma. Hegel knew history to be a slaughter bench, but subsequent history belies Hegel's youthful optimism that once, this is from 1808, youthful optimism, that once our philosophical comprehension is revolutionized, the actual world does not hold out. Instead, continuing in a recent history reconfirms Frederick Douglass's observation, which is quoted for you here. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Our challenge is, how can de jure justice come to triumph over de facto power, domestically and internationally? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We have comments to this relentlessly positive outlook by Bianca and Ancillotti. Oh, the handouts for Bianca's talk should be exact.
Okay, so let me start by thanking Candace for this very rich presentation. There are many things I couldn't comment on, like his philosophy of right or the US political history, so I decided to concentrate on a few points that have to do mostly with Kant. So one is the solution to the dilemma of the criterion, one is the notion of liberal education, and the third one is what I would say are maybe the shortcomings of the Enlightenment project. So starting with the first one, Ken has explained like the sexist empiricus quote on the dilemma of the criterion. I actually learned it as a trilemma because there is also like the idea is that whenever we question the criteria of truth or the principles of justification or even the truth of the premises we start from, we end up either in a circular reasoning or in an infinite regress, or there is in the quote also the possibility of assuming a principle dogmatically without justification. But those are like the three possibilities. And the idea is that we should give up the idea that rational justification must stand on criteria, on fixed rules or principles, and accept instead that the rationality of judgment is grounded on an open-ended practice of critical self-assessment that also essentially involves confrontations with other reasoners and thinkers where everyone involved recognizes each other as rationally competent in the matter. And I wholeheartedly agree with this attempt to solve the dilemma of the criterion. I think that my problems have more to do with the way the Kantian principles, like the categorical imperative and the universalizability test, what their role is within the solution and within the practice of self-assessment. The first point is relatively easy. It was already mentioned by Alex in the very first talk. Like, it is not clear to me that the social element involved in the principles of Kantian ethics with the universalizability test can be understood in terms of this practice, in particular because the community of beings which figures in the universalizability test is an ideal community of finite rational beings and not the actual community of living human beings who would be participating in the public reasoning practice. And the second point, so in this sense, like I understand the universalizability test as a purely armchair form of reflection, and in this sense it's also like I would say an individualist form of reflection, in the sense that the community of beings in the end comes down on the logical I, as Sasha would call it, like the ideal of rationality, which is not a pluralistic community of living human beings. And the second problem is that I'm not even sure that these principles provide a sound method for judging on issues of justice and injustice within the practice of moral deliberation. And this is, like, I know we are at the Kantian conference, but I don't 100% submit to all the principles of Kantian ethics, so this is my externalizing my doubts on that. So, moral imperatives are universal insofar as the actions they prescribe are obligatory for everyone independently of their contingent wants, all hopes and aims. That is something that Kant was also emphasizing, talking about autonomy, like we need to abstract from all those contingent aspects of the people involved. And somehow, like, it's not clear to me that we can use this, like, that we can use this test to deliberate in situations which require considering precisely those contingent wants, hopes, and aims, such as the political issues involving social minorities that were mentioned in the Anderson paper, because the problem with some of those issues is precisely that given inequality and given the differences in our experiences of the world, it is almost impossible to imagine what it is on the outside. And so this makes it difficult to use the universalizability test in this practice. And one point that was made in the notion of, in the conception of liberal education is this parallel between the theoretical and the practical case, where the idea is that to be educated in rational autonomy is to learn to step back from one's own presumptions, prejudices, beliefs and preferences, and in the same way to be educated in theoretical cognition or scientific cognition is to learn how to factor away the contingent circumstances of observation, for example, and think about how things objectively are from the universal point of view. But that parallel is also problematic for me, because while I would say that the theoretical case is quite self-evident, why it is that, it is not equally self-evident to me that one must abstract from the contingent points of view to identify the just course of action in any concrete situation. And I think that maybe the central tension that I want to bring up is that there is two ways to understand the universalizability test, and I think that this problem can be traced back directly to Kant. The problem is that there is understanding the universalizability test as a purely formal principle of morality on the one hand, and understanding it as a principle of moral deliberation that gives content to the Hippocratic oath and the idea of justice. If we understand the categorical imperative as a formal principle of morality, I think that the parallel works in the sense that, for example, the transcendental principles of theoretical cognition say only what form possible experience must have, but they don't allow to derive any specific claims about what the actual world is like. In this sense, they are formal, and their claim to universal a priori validity is usually based on a transcendental argument, which is maybe a different attempt to solve the problem of justification. So as a formal principle and a necessary condition of practical reason, one could say that categorical imperative is only a principle that says what form moral obligation must have, if there is any, so to say, but it is too general to be used to identify what is the just course of action in any specific circumstances. If one understands the categorical imperative instead as a principle of moral deliberation, which sets the limits of just action within the limits of what can be willed as a universal law by ideal finite rational beings, then the categorical imperative becomes like the principle of a school of moral theory, like the deontological school of moral theory. And I would say is not the same as the a priori principle of morality that has only says only what the form of moral obligation must be. And so I think that what is like behind this doubts that I have with the use of the universalizability test, there is also like a general thought, I would say, about what I think are the shortcomings of the Enlightenment project, which has to do with this negative attitude towards sensibility and the non-rational part of the soul, so to say that the other of reason, because Kant has this combative conception of the relationship between the faculties in the practical philosophy. And I think that there are resources in the third critique to go beyond this combative model, like when Kant starts talking about reflective judgment and beauty and the communicability of feelings. But in a way, you know, the third critique is precisely the work where one could say the Enlightenment ends and Romanticism begins. So we are like we are on the cut line between philosophical movements in a sense. And for me, it's very important when we think about liberal education that, of course, like I don't want to say like educating people and stepping back from their prejudices is, of course, necessary and very important, but I think it's not enough. Like I would want to say that there is something is missing, and this something that is missing is also like maybe an education in emotions, one could say, or in human psychology. Like there is an idea in psychoanalysis that is called integration, which is like the idea of psychological development is a state of, one would say, psychic unity, in which the rational and the non-rational part of the soul speak with the same voice. And this is a quote from Jonathan Lear, who is following Aristotle in this. And the idea is precisely not that the rational part of the soul should shut up the drives of the non-rational part of the soul, but rather that integration between the two aspects must be supported, and I would like to see this also in practice and in education to be recognized that that this the idea of integration is kind of central to human mental health or ideal psychological development, so to say. And another thought that I want to add is also that, I think that the morality, the moral sense, is really rooted in the face-to-face encounter with others and others who have different experiences. That's why it's so important for me to stress the importance of thinking about real, what the experience of the other is, and recognizing the, so to say, the irreducible individuality involved in every moral deliberation, in every situation in which we have to decide on what is just. This is not to say that the universalizability test is not usable, but you can't use it properly. You can't formulate the maxims on which people are acting if you don't look at the specific circumstances in which they are acting. And I would go so far to say that no universal principle can do justice to the complexity of the concrete situations in which people act. Not even like the not kill principle, that we talk a lot about euthanasia. So there are always the situations are always so complex that universality is not enough. And so I'm going to end with this, just to say the force that holds people together, I would say, like internally as unified beings and externally in communities and in relationships is not pure pragmatic reason, like the capacity to grasp universal principles, but it's love, it's the capacity to relate emotionally and personally to others.